I don't know where you're watching this from right now. Maybe you're sitting in your car after a double shift, feeling the weight of invisible exhaustion. Or perhaps you're at home, wondering if anyone truly sees the person behind the uniform you wear every day. It doesn't matter what time it is or where you are, but I promise you, what I'm about to share will reach into the deepest corners of your heart and remind you that every act of service, every smile given freely, every moment of quiet dignity matters more than you know. This is the story of Elena Morales, a woman whose hands knew the weight of countless plates, whose feet carried her through endless shifts in the heart of Chicago, and whose gentle spirit would unknowingly heal a broken soul worth millions. But more than that, this is a story about you, about every woman who has ever felt overlooked while making others' days brighter, who has swallowed pride to pay bills, who has chosen kindness even when the world showed her none in return. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Millennium Park Bistro, casting golden streaks across the polished marble floors where Elena had already been working for 2 hours. At 43, she moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent half her life navigating between tables, balancing trays, and reading the unspoken needs of strangers. Her black hair was pulled back in a neat bun, not a strand out of place despite the humidity that clung to Chicago's early September air. The scent of fresh brewed Colombian coffee mixed with the aroma of warm croissants, creating an atmosphere of refined comfort that attracted the city's elite. Elena's uniform was impeccable: pressed white shirt, black slacks, comfortable shoes that had walked thousands of miles across restaurant floors. But what distinguished her from her younger colleagues wasn't just her experience. It was the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, the way her dark eyes held wisdom, earned through years of silent observation, of listening to conversations she was never meant to be part of witnessing life's dramas unfold over expensive dinners and business deals worth more money than she would see in a lifetime. The bistro buzzed with the morning rush, executives discussing investment portfolios over espresso, socialites planning charity galas while picking at fruit salads, tourists marveling at the view of Lake Michigan while their credit cards absorbed the shock of Chicago's premium prices. Elena moved between them like a ghost, refilling water glasses, taking orders, ensuring every detail was perfect while remaining essentially invisible to most of the people she served. Her section included Table 12, a prime spot by the window where the city's financial district stretched out like a concrete jungle of ambition and wealth. She had worked here for 8 years, long enough to recognize the regulars, to know who preferred their coffee black and who needed extra time to decide, long enough to understand that her presence was noted only when something went wrong, that her competence was expected, but rarely acknowledged, that her humanity was secondary to her function. The breakfast crowd thinned as the clock approached 10, leaving behind the lingering sense of bacon and fresh pastries. Elena wiped down tables with methodical precision, her movements economic and efficient. Each gesture spoke of years spent perfecting the art of service, of finding pride in work that others often dismissed as temporary or beneath notice. She had raised 2 children on waitress wages, put her daughter through community college, and still managed to send money to her aging mother in Puerto Rico every month. Her tips were carefully counted and divided: rent, groceries, transportation, savings for emergencies that seemed to arrive with clockwork regularity in her modest life. The other servers, mostly young women in their 20s, chatted about weekend plans and dating apps while they rolled silverware. Elena listened with a gentle smile, remembering when her concerns were equally simple, when the future seemed full of possibilities rather than careful calculations of survival. She didn't resent their youth or their dreams. Instead, she found herself quietly protective of them, offering advice when asked, covering shifts when emergencies arose, serving as an unofficial mother figure to girls far from home, trying to make their way in an expensive city. Her manager, Robert, hurried past carrying inventory sheets, barely acknowledging her presence with a quick nod. In his world of profit margins and customer satisfaction scores, Elena was a reliable number. Low maintenance, high performance, someone who never called in sick and rarely complained. He didn't know about her arthritis that flared up during Chicago's brutal winters, didn't know about the nights she fell asleep with her feet soaking in Epsom salt, didn't know that she often skipped lunch to save money despite being on her feet for 10-hour shifts. As Elena arranged fresh flowers in small vases for each table, her phone buzzed with a text from her son Miguel. "Mom, got the job at the warehouse. Night shift, but the pay is good. Don't worry about helping with my rent this month." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her tired features. At 25, Miguel was finally finding his footing after years of struggle, and each step toward his independence felt like a victory she had helped make possible through countless early mornings and swollen feet. The lunch crowd would arrive soon, bringing with it another wave of orders, demands, and opportunities to remain professionally invisible while ensuring everyone else's day went smoothly. Elena straightened her uniform, checked her reflection in the polished surface of a serving tray, and prepared for what would become the most significant afternoon of her life, though she had no way of knowing it yet. The autumn sun climbed higher over the Chicago skyline, promising another busy day of unnoticed service and quiet dignity in a world that measured worth in dollars rather than dedication. The lunch rush descended on Millennium Park Bistro like a perfectly choreographed storm of clinking silverware, animated conversations, and the subtle pressure of time-conscious diners. Elena moved through her section with practiced efficiency, her internal clock synchronized to the rhythm of the kitchen, anticipating needs before they were voiced, solving problems before they escalated. The midday crowd brought a different energy than the morning executives, more hurried, more demanding, less patient with delays. Table 12 welcomed a new group, 3 women in their 50s, dressed in the understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted wealth. Their handbags bore designer labels, their jewelry caught the light just so, and their conversation flowed between charity committee meetings and weekend homes in the Hamptons. Elena approached with her customary professionalism, notepad ready, smile genuine despite her knowledge that she would remain peripheral to their world. "Good afternoon, ladies. Can I start you with something to drink?" Her voice carried the warm musicality of her Puerto Rican heritage, softened by years of Chicago living. "Water with lemon, no ice," said the blonde woman without looking up from her phone. She was scrolling through what appeared to be real estate listings, properties with price tags that represented more money than Elena would earn in several lifetimes. "I'll have the sparkling water, and could you make sure the glass is actually clean this time?" This from a brunette whose tone carried the casual dismissiveness of someone accustomed to service staff who existed solely for her convenience. The third woman, a redhead with kind eyes, offered Elena a apologetic smile. "I'd love an iced tea, please. Sweet tea if you have it." Elena nodded, taking note of each preference while simultaneously calculating the rhythm needed to serve their meals efficiently. She had learned long ago to read the dynamics of her tables. The blonde was the alpha, the brunette followed her lead in rudeness, and the redhead seemed uncomfortable with the casual cruelty, but unlikely to challenge it. As she returned with their beverages, she caught fragments of their conversation about investment portfolios and cryptocurrency markets. The blonde was explaining her latest Bitcoin acquisition, numbers that represented more than Elena's annual salary discussed as casually as weekend shopping plans. Elena set down each glass with careful precision, ensuring the lemon was positioned perfectly, the napkins placed just so. "Are you ready to order, or do you need a few more minutes?" she asked, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the way the brunette had already criticized the cleanliness of glassware that Elena knew was spotless. "We're not ready," the blonde said curtly, not bothering to look up from her phone. "Come back in 10 minutes. Elena nodded and moved to check on her other tables, where similar scenes of casual dismissal played out with numbing regularity. A businessman barked orders while conducting a phone call about stock options, apparently unaware that she was a human being deserving of basic courtesy. A young couple, clearly uncomfortable with the prices but trying to impress each other, took their anxiety out on her timing and suggestions. The kitchen moved with military precision during rush hour, expeditors calling out orders, line cooks working with focused intensity over sizzling pans and blazing grills, the air thick with the aromas of searing meat and fragrant herbs, the sound of orders being plated creating a percussion that Elena had learned to interpret like a language. She moved between kitchen and dining room like a translator, carrying not just food but the hopes of chefs for their creations to be appreciated, the needs of diners to be fed and satisfied. When she returned to table 12, the women had barely glanced at their menus. "Another few minutes," the blonde said without looking up, apparently deep in a text conversation about her son's prep school tuition, a figure she mentioned casually that could have paid Elena's rent for 2 years. Elena smiled patiently, though she could see other tables needing attention, could feel the subtle pressure of her manager's expectant gaze across the dining room. The art of service required not just efficiency, but the ability to be infinitely patient with people who seemed to view patience as their inherent right rather than a gift freely given. The brunette finally looked up from her own phone conversation about dividend payments and mutual funds. "I suppose we should eat something. What do you recommend?" The question was asked with the tone of someone who expected entertainingly precise descriptions, but had already decided she would find fault regardless of Elena's answer. Elena had given this recommendation hundreds of times, knew exactly which dishes would appeal to their demographic, understood the kitchen's strengths and the chef's pride. "The salmon is beautiful today, Atlantic caught, served with roasted vegetables and a lemon herb sauce. The chicken is also excellent, free-range and locally sourced with wild mushroom risotto." "Is the fish fresh or frozen?" the blonde demanded, as if Elena's 8 years of experience and evident knowledge counted for nothing. "Fresh, delivered this morning from our supplier," Elena responded evenly, though she could feel the familiar tightening in her chest that came with being questioned as if she were either incompetent or dishonest. The ordering process continued with the slow torture of customers who seemed to take pleasure in changing their minds, asking detailed questions about preparation methods, demanding modifications that would complicate the kitchen's workflow during the busiest hour of the day. Elena took notes with careful precision, repeated each order back for confirmation, maintained her professional smile while internally calculating how this extended interaction was affecting her ability to serve her other tables promptly. As she finally headed to the kitchen with their order, she caught the tail end of their conversation resuming. "I don't know why these people never seem to understand simple requests. You'd think they'd be grateful for the work." The words followed her like a slap, casual cruelty disguised as observation, the reduction of her humanity to mere economic function in their privileged worldview. The lunch rush continued its relentless pace, each table bringing its own challenges, its own small tests of her professional composure and personal dignity. Elena had learned long ago that her role required her to absorb these moments of casual disrespect like a sponge, to remain pleasant and efficient regardless of how she was treated, to find her pride in the excellence of her service rather than in the recognition of her clients. But today, for reasons she couldn't quite identify, the small cuts seemed to go deeper, the weight of invisibility felt heavier on her shoulders. The afternoon sun streamed through the bistro's tall windows, warming the dining room as Elena moved between tables with the measured grace of someone carrying more than just plates and glasses. She carried the quiet dignity of work done well, despite the world's indifference to her humanity. The catastrophe began with something as simple as a nervous tremor in Elena's hand as she approached table 12 with their entrees. She had been on her feet for 6 hours straight, having covered the morning shift for a colleague whose child was sick, and the arthritis in her joints was flaring with the change in Chicago's autumn weather. The salmon plate, perfectly arranged with its colorful vegetables and artistic drizzle of lemon herb sauce, balanced on her serving tray alongside the modified chicken dish and the custom salad that had required 3 trips to the kitchen to get exactly right. The blonde woman was in the middle of an animated phone conversation about her portfolio manager's latest cryptocurrency recommendations, gesturing wildly with her manicured hands while completely ignoring Elena's approach. The brunette was scrolling through luxury vacation rentals on her tablet, comparing European villa prices with the casual interest of someone for whom money was merely a tool for acquiring pleasure. Only the kind-eyed redhead looked up expectantly as Elena carefully navigated between chairs and purses worth more than most people's monthly paychecks. "The salmon for you," Elena said softly to the blonde, who continued her phone conversation without acknowledgement. Elena waited a moment, the plate growing heavier in her hands, before gently placing it in front of the woman, who didn't pause her discussion of investment returns and capital gains to notice the careful presentation of her meal. The brunette received her chicken with equally minimal acknowledgement, her attention still focused on comparing the amenities of different Mediterranean resorts. Elena moved with practiced precision, ensuring each dish was positioned correctly, each napkin was properly placed, each detail attended to, despite the complete indifference of her customers to the care she took in her work. It was as she placed the final salad that her tired body betrayed her. The combination of exhaustion, pain from standing too long, and the slight bump from the blonde's elbow as she gestured during her phone call created a perfect storm. Elena's hand trembled, just slightly, just enough for the plate to slip perhaps an inch too much to the left. The ceramic edge caught the rim of the blonde's water glass, sending it toppling directly into the woman's designer lap. The silence that followed was deafening. The blonde's phone conversation stopped mid-sentence. The brunette looked up from her tablet. Conversations at nearby tables paused as all eyes turned to witness what would happen next. Elena felt the heat rise in her cheeks, her heart hammering against her ribs as she reached for her napkin. "I'm so sorry," she began, moving immediately into damage control mode, but the blonde's voice cut through her apology like a blade. "Are you kidding me right now?" The woman stood abruptly, water dripping from her cream-colored silk blouse and designer dress. "Do you have any idea what this dress cost? This is Armani, not something you buy at a department store." Elena's training kicked in even as her spirit began to crumble. "Please, let me help you clean." "Don't touch me," the blonde snapped, her voice rising to ensure everyone in the restaurant could hear. "I can't believe the incompetence. How long have you been doing this job? This is completely unacceptable." The manager, Robert, appeared as if summoned by the commotion, his face already wearing the apologetic expression he reserved for situations involving valuable customers and service failures. "Ma'am, I am so sorry about this incident. Please let us take care of everything." Elena stood frozen, napkin still in hand, as the humiliation washed over her in waves. She could feel every eye in the restaurant focused on her, could hear the whispered conversations beginning at nearby tables, could sense the mixture of embarrassment and fascination that such public destruction of dignity always inspired in observers. "This is completely unprofessional," the brunette joined in, as if emboldened by her friend's outrage. "We come here regularly, and we expect a certain level of service. This is not what we're paying for." The blonde continued her public denunciation, her voice carrying across the dining room. "Look at this dress. This will cost hundreds to clean if it can even be saved, and my purse is soaked too. This is absolutely ridiculous." Elena felt the familiar sting of tears threatening behind her eyes, but her years of experience had taught her to maintain composure even in moments of complete humiliation. She kept her voice steady, professional, even as her world crumbled around her. "I take full responsibility, and I sincerely apologize. Please allow us to cover any cleaning costs and—" "Oh, you'll cover it." The blonde's laugh was sharp and cruel. "On a waitress salary? Do you even understand what quality clothing costs? This dress is worth more than you probably make in a month." The statement hung in the air like poison, reducing Elena's humanity to her economic function, measuring her worth in dollars rather than dignity. Around the dining room, she could see the mixture of reactions, some customers looking uncomfortable with the public shaming, others watching with the fascination people reserve for witnessing someone else's destruction, a few already reaching for their phones to capture the drama. Robert intervened, his voice oily with the practiced apology of hospitality management. "Ladies, please allow us to comp your entire meal today and provide vouchers for future visits. And of course, we'll cover all cleaning expenses immediately." But the blonde wasn't finished with her public evisceration. "This isn't about money," she declared, though everything about her demeanor suggested otherwise. "This is about basic competence. If someone can't handle carrying a simple plate without destroying property, maybe they shouldn't be working in a place like this." Elena stood there, absorbing each word like a physical blow, her 8 years of dedicated service, her perfect record, her countless satisfied customers, all erased by one moment of human vulnerability. She thought of her children, who would have to hear about this humiliation. She thought of her colleagues, who were watching this destruction of dignity from the safety of the kitchen doorway. She thought of all the plates she had carried successfully, all the smiles she had offered freely, all the quiet pride she had taken in work well done. "Perhaps," the blonde continued, clearly enjoying her captive audience, "the restaurant should consider hiring people who are actually qualified for the job. There are plenty of people who would be grateful for the opportunity and wouldn't waste customers' time with this kind of incompetence." Elena finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "You're absolutely right to be upset, and I take full responsibility. I've been doing this work for 8 years, and I've never had an accident like this before. I'm truly sorry." But her apology, delivered with the dignified grace that had always defined her service, only seemed to fuel the blonde's anger further. 8 years, and you still can't carry a plate properly? Maybe it's time to consider a different line of work? The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual completeness, the reduction of a human being to her single mistake, the public destruction of someone whose only crime was exhaustion and a moment of physical vulnerability. Elena felt something break inside her chest, not her spirit exactly, but her faith that dignity and hard work would always be enough to earn basic respect. As she began cleaning up the water and broken glass with shaking hands, she could hear the blonde explaining to anyone who would listen about the cost of the ruined clothing, the inconvenience, the absolute failure of service standards. Each word was another nail in the coffin of Elena's quiet pride, another reminder that in this world of privilege and wealth, her humanity was secondary to their comfort, her dignity disposable in service of their satisfaction. The lunch rush continued around this moment of destruction, other tables receiving their meals, other conversations resuming, the machinery of the restaurant grinding forward, while Elena's 8 years of dedication crumbled under the weight of one spilled glass and the cruel mathematics of a society that measured worth in dollars rather than decency. At table 15, a man in an expensive suit had been watching the entire scene unfold with growing discomfort. James Sullivan was the kind of customer Elena usually served without much interaction, wealthy, powerful, accustomed to invisibility from service staff. He owned a portfolio of tech investments worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes. His cryptocurrency holdings alone, representing millions in digital assets that fluctuated with market whims, he understood better than most. But something about witnessing this public humiliation was stirring an unfamiliar feeling in his chest. Sullivan had built his fortune through careful observation, reading market trends and human behavior with equal precision. He had watched Elena work for months during his regular business lunches at the bistro, had noticed her quiet competence, her gentle manner with difficult customers, her ability to anticipate needs without being intrusive. Unlike many of his peers, he developed a habit of actually seeing the people who served him, recognizing their professionalism even if he rarely acknowledged it directly. As the blonde continued her verbal assault, Sullivan found himself remembering his own daughter, who had worked as a waitress during college to pay for expenses his money couldn't legally cover due to divorce agreements. He remembered her stories about difficult customers, about the exhaustion of being on her feet for hours, about the way some people treated service workers as if they were somehow less human than paying customers. The parallel struck him with uncomfortable force. Elena was now on her knees, carefully collecting pieces of broken glass while the blonde's friend filmed the scene with her phone, apparently planning to share this moment of someone else's humiliation on social media. The casual cruelty of it, the reduction of a human being's dignity to entertainment content, sparked something protective in Sullivan that surprised him with its intensity. "Excuse me," he said, standing from his table and walking over with the quiet authority that came from years of commanding boardrooms. His voice was gentle but carried enough presence to interrupt the ongoing tirade. "I couldn't help but notice what happened here." The blonde turned to him, her demeanor immediately shifting as she assessed his expensive suit, his confident bearing, the subtle markers of wealth and power that she instinctively recognized and respected. "Oh, hello. Yes, it's been absolutely frustrating. The service here has really declined." Sullivan smiled, but there was steel beneath the pleasantness. "Actually, I've been coming here for over a year, and I've watched this waitress work. She's consistently professional, attentive, and skilled. I suspect she's been on her feet for hours today, probably covering extra shifts, probably dealing with dozens of demanding customers with the same patience she just showed you." Elena looked up from collecting glass shards, surprise flickering across her features. In all her years of service, she had rarely seen a customer speak up on behalf of staff, especially not someone of obvious wealth and influence. "Well," the blonde said, her tone becoming defensive, "accidents are one thing, but the level of carelessness—" "Was an accident," Sullivan interrupted smoothly. "I saw exactly what happened. Your elbow bumped her arm as she was placing the salad, which caused the glass to tip. Given that she was managing multiple plates while you were gesturing during your phone call, I'd say she handled a difficult situation about as well as anyone could." The dynamic in the room shifted subtly. Other customers were now watching this unexpected defense of the waitress, this challenge to the established hierarchy of customer superiority and staff subservience. Elena felt a flutter of hope in her chest, mixed with embarrassment that this moment of vulnerability was playing out so publicly. Sullivan reached into his wallet and pulled out several $100 bills, placing them on table 12. "This should more than cover your cleaning expenses," he said to the blonde, "and I think it would be appropriate to apologize to Elena for the way you've just treated her." The blonde's face flushed red. Apologize? For her mistake? For reducing another human being to her worst moment instead of recognizing her years of dedicated service, Sullivan replied evenly. "I've built my fortune on understanding value, and I can tell you that competent, dignified employees like Elena are worth far more than most people realize." Elena stood slowly, broken glass safely disposed of, her uniform somehow still neat, despite everything that had transpired. She looked at Sullivan with gratitude mixed with confusion. This kind of public support was so foreign to her experience that she wasn't quite sure how to respond. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But it really was my fault. I take full responsibility." Sullivan turned to her with genuine respect. Taking responsibility for an accident while maintaining your professionalism under attack? That's not something to apologize for. That's something to admire. The blonde, clearly uncomfortable with this reversal of power dynamics, gathered her purse and prepared to leave. "This is ridiculous. We shouldn't have to deal with this kind of drama when we're trying to have a simple lunch." "You're absolutely right," Sullivan agreed. "You shouldn't have to deal with drama. Neither should Elena. She should be able to do her job with dignity without being publicly humiliated for being human." As the three women left, the blonde muttering about finding a new restaurant, Sullivan turned back to Elena. "Are you okay?" Elena nodded, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "Thank you for speaking up. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Sullivan replied simply. "In my business, I've learned that character reveals itself under pressure. What I just witnessed was someone maintaining grace under completely unfair circumstances. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." The dining room slowly returned to normal. Conversations resuming, orders being taken, the restaurant's rhythm reasserting itself. But something had shifted in Elena's world. For the first time in years, someone had seen not just her function as a waitress, but her value as a human being. Someone had stood up for her dignity when she was too professional to defend herself. Sullivan returned to his table but found his appetite had disappeared. He sat thinking about power dynamics, about the casual cruelty he witnessed daily in business and social settings, about the difference between building wealth and building character. He thought about Elena, still working her shift with quiet professionalism, despite having been publicly humiliated, and felt an unfamiliar stirring of respect mixed with something else, perhaps recognition of the kind of strength that couldn't be bought or traded on any market. The rest of Elena's shift passed in a blur of routine tasks performed with mechanical precision while her mind processed what had just happened. The humiliation still burned, but it was tempered now by the unexpected gift of being seen, of being defended, of having her dignity recognized by someone whose opinion seemed to matter in the social hierarchy that usually rendered her invisible. As she wiped down tables and counted her tips, Elena found herself thinking about James Sullivan, wondering what kind of man spoke up for a waitress when he had nothing to gain and everything to risk by challenging the established order of customer supremacy. The afternoon sun slanted lower through the bistro's windows, casting long shadows across floors, still bearing witness to a moment when human decency had interrupted the usual mathematics of service and silence. 3 weeks after the incident at Table 12, Elena moved through her shifts with a subtle change in her demeanor that her coworkers noticed but couldn't quite define. She still carried plates with the same careful precision, still smiled at difficult customers with genuine warmth, still maintained the professional grace that had defined her 8 years at Millennium Park Bistro. But there was something different in her eyes, a quiet awareness that she was more than the sum of her mistakes, more than the function she performed for people who often treated her as part of the scenery rather than a human being deserving of basic respect. The memory of James Sullivan's unexpected defense had nestled somewhere deep in her chest, a small, bright thing that warmed her during the difficult moments that inevitably came with service work. When customers spoke to her dismissively, when managers treated her as expendable, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure, she remembered that someone had seen her worth and spoken up for her dignity. It was a gift she hadn't expected and wasn't quite sure how to process, but it had changed something fundamental in her understanding of her own value. Sullivan had returned to the bistro several times since the incident, always requesting a table in Elena's section, always polite and professional in his interactions. He tipped generously, but not ostentatiously, asked after her well-being without being inappropriately personal, and treated her with the kind of respectful courtesy that acknowledged her expertise and professionalism. Their exchanges were brief but marked by mutual recognition. He had seen her character under pressure, and she had witnessed his willingness to use his privilege in defense of someone who couldn't defend herself. Elena found herself looking forward to these interactions, not with romantic interest, but with the deeper satisfaction of being truly seen by another person. In Sullivan's presence, she felt less invisible, more worthy of the space she occupied in the world. It was a feeling she had forgotten she deserved, a reminder that her humanity extended far beyond her ability to carry plates and remember orders. But the universe, as Elena had learned through years of struggle and survival, rarely allowed moments of peace to last without testing them. The challenge came on a busy Thursday evening, when the bistro was full of the usual crowd of business dinners and social gatherings, and Elena was working her way through a particularly demanding section of tables filled with clients celebrating a successful stock merger. She had just served the appetizers to Table 8, a group of investment bankers celebrating their latest Bitcoin portfolio gains, when she felt a familiar tremor of unease. Robert, the manager, was walking toward her with an expression she had learned to recognize and fear, the look of someone about to deliver bad news while simultaneously distancing himself from responsibility for it. Elena, he said, his voice carrying the false gentleness that preceded difficult conversations. I need to speak with you privately when you have a moment. Elena's stomach tightened, but she maintained her professional composure. Of course. Let me just check on my tables, and I'll be right with you. She moved through her section with practiced efficiency, ensuring water glasses were filled, checking on meal satisfaction, handling the small details that kept customers happy and tips flowing. But her mind was racing through possibilities, reviewing recent shifts for any mistakes, any customer complaints, any reason she might be in trouble. The incident with the spilled water glass had happened weeks ago, and she thought it was behind her, but the uncertainty that came with service work meant that past problems could resurface without warning. Robert was waiting in the small office behind the kitchen, his expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested he was about to deliver news he didn't want to be responsible for. Elena entered and closed the door behind her, preparing for whatever was coming with the quiet strength that had carried her through countless difficult moments in her life. Elena, I want you to know that I think you're a valuable employee, Robert began, and Elena's heart sank. Conversations that started with reassurances about value rarely ended with good news. Your work has been consistently excellent, and I've always been impressed with your professionalism and dedication. But? Elena prompted quietly, knowing there was always a but in conversations that began this way. Robert sighed, looking genuinely uncomfortable. We received a complaint about the incident 3 weeks ago with the spilled water. Apparently, the customer has been in touch with corporate, and they're concerned about liability issues. Elena felt the world tilt slightly around her. I don't understand. Mr. Sullivan offered to pay for the cleaning costs, and the customer left that day without requesting anything further. I know, Robert said quickly. But apparently she's been thinking about it, and she's claiming that her dress was damaged beyond repair. She's threatening legal action, talking about pain and suffering, making this into a much bigger issue than it seemed at the time. The injustice of it hit Elena like a physical blow. She had apologized sincerely, had taken full responsibility, had maintained her professionalism throughout the public humiliation. And now, weeks later, that moment of human vulnerability was being weaponized against her, transformed into a legal threat that could destroy not just her job, but her ability to find work elsewhere in the industry. What does corporate want? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Robert's silence spoke volumes before he finally found the words. They want to minimize liability. They think it would be best if you took some time off while they review the situation. Elena understood the euphemism. She was being suspended, probably as a prelude to termination. 8 years of dedicated service, hundreds of satisfied customers, countless shifts covered for colleagues, all of it erased by one spilled glass and a customer's decision to transform an accident into a legal weapon. I see, she said quietly, maintaining the dignity that had always defined her even as her world crumbled around her. How long is this suspension? Indefinitely, Robert admitted, looking genuinely ashamed. Elena, I want you to know that this isn't fair. You're one of our best servers, and if it were up to me... But it wasn't up to him, and they both knew it. In the mathematics of corporate liability, her 8 years of service weighed less than the potential cost of a legal battle with a wealthy customer who had the resources to make trouble. Elena was expendable in ways that the customer was not. Her value measured not in human terms, but in purely economic calculations that reduced her to a line item on a risk assessment spreadsheet. Elena nodded, taking off her apron with the same careful precision she brought to all her tasks. I understand. When should I collect my things? Your final paycheck will be ready by Friday, Robert said, avoiding her eyes. Elena, I'm truly sorry about this. If I get any calls for references... Thank you, she replied simply, though they both knew that a reference from a restaurant that had suspended her due to customer complaints would carry little weight with future employers. Elena walked through the kitchen one last time, past the line cooks who had become her colleagues and friends, past the prep stations where she had sometimes helped during quiet moments. past the dish pit where she had occasionally pitched in during understaffed shifts. Her colleagues looked up as she passed, reading the situation in her posture and the apron folded in her hands, offering sympathetic nods and quiet murmurs of support. She collected her purse from her locker, changed out of her uniform for the final time, and walked through the dining room where she had spent 8 years of her life serving people who often saw her as invisible. At table 15, James Sullivan was having dinner with a business associate, discussing investment strategies and market projections. Their eyes met as she passed, and she saw recognition and concern flash across his features. Elena paused at his table, maintaining her professional composure despite the tears threatening behind her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing me when others didn't." Sullivan looked confused, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding the context. "Elena, is everything all right?" But she was already walking away, through the front door of the Bisto and out into the Chicago evening, carrying with her the weight of injustice and the knowledge that dignity and hard work weren't always enough to protect against the casual cruelty of people who measured worth in dollars rather than character. Behind her, James Sullivan sat puzzled and concerned, realizing that something important had just happened, but not yet understanding what he had lost when Elena Morales walked out of his life. The city lights blurred slightly as Elena walked home through streets she had traveled countless times after long shifts, but tonight felt different. Final, like the end of a chapter she had never wanted to close. The silence that followed Elena's departure from Millennium Park Bistro was subtle but profound, the kind of absence that reveals itself gradually, like a musical note that stops playing and leaves the entire symphony somehow incomplete. James Sullivan noticed it first during his lunch meeting the following Tuesday, when a younger server with nervous hands and an uncertain smile delivered his order with none of the quiet competence he had grown accustomed to from Elena. The new waitress, Sarah, according to her name tag, was clearly trying her best, but she lacked Elena's intuitive understanding of timing, her ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed, her gift for being present when needed and invisible when not. Sullivan found himself missing small gestures he had barely registered at the time. The way Elena had always ensured his water glass was full without his asking, how she had remembered his preference for extra lemon with his iced tea, her ability to gauge his mood and adjust her level of conversation accordingly. "Where's Elena today?" he asked Robert during a brief moment when the manager passed by his table. Robert's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "She's no longer with us," he said in the carefully neutral tone that hospitality managers use when discussing personnel matters they can't fully explain. Sullivan felt an unexpected jolt of concern. "I hope she wasn't let go because of that incident with the spilled water a few weeks ago." The manager's uncomfortable silence was answer enough. Sullivan's mind, trained by years of reading between the lines in business negotiations, immediately understood the likely sequence of events: corporate liability concerns, legal threats from entitled customers, the expendability of service workers in the face of potential lawsuits. His own intervention, which had felt like a small act of decency at the time, had apparently been insufficient to protect Elena from the machinery of institutional self-preservation. Sullivan finished his lunch with diminished appetite, troubled by the realization that his brief moment of speaking up had been inadequate, that Elena had borne consequences he had been shielded from by his wealth and status. He had witnessed her grace under pressure, had recognized her dignity and professionalism, but had failed to consider that in a world where customers complained and corporations calculated risk, individual character mattered less than potential liability. Over the following weeks, the absence of Elena's presence became more apparent to regular customers who had grown accustomed to her service without necessarily appreciating it. The businessman, who always ordered the same salmon salad, found himself having to repeat his preferences to different servers each visit. The elderly couple who came for anniversary dinners missed Elena's gentle attentiveness to the wife's dietary restrictions and the husband's hearing difficulties. The young professional women who often lunched together found themselves being judged by servers who hadn't yet learned that their modest appearance did not necessarily correlate with their tipping generosity. But nowhere was Elena's absence felt more keenly than in the kitchen, where the line cooks and prep staff had lost their most reliable liaison with the front of house. Elena had possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate kitchen timing, to communicate special requests clearly, to smooth the inevitable friction between the pressure cooker environment of food preparation and the public-facing demands of customer service. Without her steady presence, service hiccups became more frequent, orders got confused, and the seamless operation of the restaurant developed small cracks that gradually widened into larger problems. Sullivan, meanwhile, found himself thinking about Elena at unexpected moments. During board meetings where he discussed portfolio diversifications and cryptocurrency investments worth millions, he would remember her quiet professionalism and wonder how someone could maintain such dignity while earning wages that barely covered basic living expenses. While reviewing profit margins and asset allocations for his various businesses, he thought about the mathematics of service work, the way tips and hourly wages added up to survival rather than security, the way a single customer complaint could destroy years of dedicated employment. He began asking discreet questions, using his business connections to learn more about Elena's situation. Through a friend who worked in hospitality management, he discovered that Elena had indeed been terminated following a customer complaint, that she was struggling to find new employment due to the circumstances of her departure, that the restaurant industry's informal network meant that news of problem employees spread faster than recommendations for good ones. The injustice of it gnawed at him. Elena had demonstrated exactly the kind of character that Sullivan valued in his business relationships: integrity under pressure, professionalism in difficult circumstances, the ability to maintain dignity while serving others. Yet, these same qualities, which would have made her invaluable in any other context, had been insufficient to protect her from the casual cruelty of a customer who had decided to transform an accident into a legal weapon. Sullivan's daughter, now graduated from college and working in nonprofit management, listened to his story during one of their monthly dinners with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. "Dad, this happens all the time," she said. "When I was waitressing during college, I saw good people get fired for things that weren't their fault, just because customers complained and management didn't want to deal with the hassle." "But Elena didn't deserve this," Sullivan protested. "She was excellent at her job, professional, competent, gracious even when being treated badly." His daughter smiled sadly. "Deserve doesn't factor into it much in service work. The customer is always right, even when they're completely wrong, especially if they have money and influence." The conversation stayed with Sullivan long after dinner ended. He began to understand that Elena's situation was not an isolated injustice, but part of a larger system that placed the comfort and satisfaction of paying customers above the dignity and security of the workers who served them. His own privilege had shielded him from seeing this dynamic clearly, had allowed him to imagine that speaking up in one moment of public humiliation had been sufficient to address a problem that was much deeper and more systematic than he had realized. As autumn deepened into Chicago's brutal winter, Sullivan continued to eat at Millennium Park Bistro occasionally, but the experience felt hollow without Elena's presence. The service was adequate but unremarkable, the atmosphere somehow less warm despite the unchanged decor and menu. He found himself wondering where Elena was working now, whether she had found a position that appreciated her skills, whether she was struggling financially, whether the incident that had cost her this job was continuing to affect her ability to find new employment. The thought that his moment of intervention might have been too little, too late, began to weigh on him. He had built his fortune through decisive action, through the ability to identify opportunities and act on them quickly and effectively. But in Elena's case, his response had been reactive rather than proactive, a single gesture of decency that had failed to address the underlying dynamics that made such injustices possible. Sullivan began to realize that true justice would require more than speaking up in a moment of crisis. It would require using his influence and resources to address the systemic problems that made workers like Elena vulnerable to the whims of customers and the risk calculations of corporate management. The question was whether he was prepared to act on that understanding, or whether Elena Morales would remain simply a memory of dignity lost to circumstances beyond her control. The winter wind howled through Chicago's streets, carrying with it the promise of change for those bold enough to pursue it. The search for Elena Morales began on a frigid December morning when Chicago was wrapped in the kind of winter that made every outdoor moment feel like an endurance test. James Sullivan's breath crystallized in the air as he walked out of his downtown office building, having made a decision that surprised even him with its intensity and determination. He had spent sleepless nights thinking about Elena's situation, about the injustice of her termination, about his own failure to act when action might have made a difference. Sullivan's first stop was a private investigation firm that specialized in locating people, a service he had occasionally used for business purposes, but never for something so personal. The investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Chen, listened to the story with the practiced neutrality of someone who had heard stranger requests, though something in Sullivan's earnestness seemed to engage his interest beyond mere professional obligation. "Let me understand this correctly," Chen said, reviewing his notes. "You want me to find a former waitress who was fired from a restaurant where you're a customer, not because you have any romantic interest, but because you want to help her?" Sullivan heard how it sounded and felt momentarily foolish, but the memory of Elena's dignity under attack strengthened his resolve. She was treated unjustly. She lost her job because a wealthy customer decided to make trouble about an accident that wasn't even her fault. "I have the resources to help, and I failed to act when I should have." Chen nodded slowly. "It's unusual, but I've worked stranger cases. What information do you have about her?" The details Sullivan could provide were frustratingly limited. Elena Morales, approximately 43 years old, had worked at Millennium Park Bistro for 8 years, had mentioned having children, had spoken in passing about family in Puerto Rico. It wasn't much to build a search on, but Chen had worked with less. "Give me a few days," Chen said. "People in the service industry usually have employment records, tax filings, apartment leases. If she's still in Chicago, I'll find her." While Chen began his search, Sullivan found himself thinking more deeply about what he hoped to accomplish. His initial impulse was simple: to help Elena find new employment, perhaps to compensate her for the financial hardship caused by her unjust termination. But as he considered the broader implications, he began to understand that Elena's situation was part of a larger problem that required systemic rather than individual solutions. Sullivan's business empire had been built on identifying market inefficiencies and developing solutions that addressed unmet needs. As he thought about Elena's experience, he began to see the service industry's treatment of workers as exactly that kind of systemic inefficiency, a waste of human talent and dignity that created problems for businesses and customers alike. Good servers like Elena were valuable assets, but the industry's structure made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of arbitrary treatment that had cost Elena her job. The idea that began forming in Sullivan's mind was ambitious and complex. What if he could create a business model that protected good service workers while still meeting the needs of restaurants and customers? What if there was a way to build dignity and security into service work without compromising efficiency or profitability? 3 days later, Chen called with an address. Elena was working at a small diner on Chicago's South Side, a neighborhood that Sullivan's wealth had allowed him to avoid for most of his adult life. The contrast between her former workplace and her current situation was stark. From Millennium Park Bistro's upscale atmosphere to Rosie's all-night diner, where the primary clientele consisted of shift workers, late-night commuters, and people for whom dining out was a necessity rather than a luxury. Sullivan drove through neighborhoods where his expensive car drew stares and honking horns, where pawn shops and check-cashing businesses occupied corners that downtown held bank branches and investment offices. The economic geography of Chicago revealed itself in ways that his usual routes between penthouse and office building had never shown him. Reminders that the wealth concentrated in his portfolio represented real differences in how people lived, worked, and survived. Rosie's Diner occupied a corner building that had clearly seen better decades, its neon sign flickering intermittently and its windows fogged with condensation from the warmth inside. Sullivan parked across the street and sat for several minutes, suddenly uncertain about his plan. What right did he have to insert himself into Elena's life? What if she was content with her new job? What if his intervention would be unwelcome? What if his assumptions about helping were really about assuaging his own guilt rather than addressing her actual needs? But the memory of Elena's grace under attack, her professional dignity maintained even while being publicly humiliated, gave him the courage to cross the street and enter the diner. The contrast with Millennium Park Bistro was immediate and stark. Worn linoleum floors instead of marble, fluorescent lights instead of elegant fixtures, the smell of fried food and strong coffee instead of carefully crafted culinary presentations. Elena was behind the counter, wearing a different uniform but carrying herself with the same quiet professionalism that had distinguished her at the upscale bistro. She was talking to a regular customer, an elderly man whose work clothes suggested he was probably on his way to or from a manual labor job, and her interactions showed the same gentle attentiveness Sullivan remembered from their previous encounters. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, surprise flickered across her features, followed by something that might have been wariness. In this context, Sullivan's expensive suit and obvious wealth marked him as someone who didn't belong, whose presence probably meant problems or complications for workers who needed their jobs too much to risk offending customers. "Mr. Sullivan," Elena said, approaching his table with professional caution. "This is certainly unexpected. What brings you to this part of town?" Sullivan felt the weight of his privilege acutely, understanding that his presence in her new workplace might be creating exactly the kind of attention and complication that could cost Elena another job. "I wanted to see how you were doing," he said quietly, "and I wanted to apologize." "Apologize for what?" Elena asked, though her tone suggested she suspected what was coming. "For not doing more to prevent what happened to you at the bistro," Sullivan replied. "I spoke up in that one moment, but I failed to consider the consequences you might face afterward. I should have anticipated that corporate would prioritize liability over justice." Elena's expression softened slightly, recognition of his genuine remorse tempering her initial wariness. "You stood up for me when no one else would," she said. "That meant more than you know. What happened afterward wasn't your fault." But Sullivan wasn't willing to let himself off so easily. "I have resources, influence, connections. I could have done more to protect you from retaliation. I could have intervened with corporate, could have made sure you kept your job." Elena looked around the diner, at the other customers who were beginning to notice this unusual conversation between the well-dressed man and their server. "Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your concern, but I'm working now. This isn't really the place for this conversation." Sullivan nodded, understanding that his presence was potentially creating problems for her in her new job. "Of course. But Elena, I'd like to talk with you when you have time. Not here, somewhere private. I have an idea, something that might be beneficial for both of us." Elena studied his face, reading something sincere in his expression. After 8 years of serving people, she had developed an ability to distinguish between genuine offers and manipulative promises, between real respect and condescending charity. Something in Sullivan's demeanor suggested this fell into the former category, though she remained cautious about what he might be proposing. "My shift ends at 3, she said finally. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks north of here. Decent coffee, quiet enough to talk." Sullivan nodded gratefully. "I'll be there." As he left the diner, Elena watched him go with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. In her experience, when wealthy men sought private conversations with working women, the outcomes were rarely as altruistic as they initially appeared. But she remembered Sullivan's defense of her dignity at the bistro, remembered the way he had recognized her professionalism when others saw only her function, and decided that whatever he was proposing deserved at least a listening ear. The coffee shop was indeed quiet. A neighborhood place where the barista knew regular customers by their drink preferences, and the atmosphere encouraged conversation rather than laptop work. Sullivan arrived early and claimed a corner table, nervous about how to begin a conversation that would determine whether Elena's story ended in continued struggle or unexpected opportunity. When Elena entered at 3:15, still in her diner uniform but carrying herself with the dignity that had first caught Sullivan's attention months earlier, he stood to greet her with respect rather than the casual familiarity that wealth often assumed toward service workers. "Thank you for meeting with me," he said as she sat down. "Can I buy you coffee? Something to eat?" Elena ordered coffee, black, and waited for Sullivan to explain why he had sought her out. Why he had traveled across the city to find her, what kind of conversation required this level of privacy and preparation. The answer would change both their lives in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The coffee shop hummed with quiet afternoon energy as Elena wrapped her hands around her mug, studying James Sullivan's face across the small table. The steam rose between them like a barrier that might lift or solidify, depending on what he was about to propose. Sullivan had rehearsed this conversation during the drive over, but sitting here with Elena's intelligent eyes focused on him, he realized that all his preparation couldn't account for the complexity of what he was attempting to do. "Elena," he began, then paused, recognizing that her full attention was both a gift and a responsibility. "What I'm about to propose might sound strange, even presumptuous. Please hear me out before you decide I've lost my mind." Elena's lips curved in the slightest smile. "In my experience, conversations that start with warnings about presumption usually live up to the warning. But I'm listening." Sullivan took a breath, organizing his thoughts. "I've been thinking about what happened to you at the bistro, not just the incident itself, but the way the system handled it afterward. A customer makes an unreasonable complaint about an accident, and a good employee loses her job because corporate wants to avoid potential legal costs. It's not just unfair to you, it's bad business." "Bad business how?" Elena asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "Because restaurants lose valuable employees like you. Customers lose quality service, and the industry creates an environment where workers have no security and no incentive to develop real skills or loyalty," Sullivan explained, warming to his theme. "It's economically inefficient and morally wrong." Elena nodded slowly. "I've worked in restaurants for 15 years. That's pretty much how the industry works. Customers complain, management panics, workers get blamed. It's not fair, but it's predictable." "But what if it didn't have to work that way?" Sullivan leaned forward, his enthusiasm evident. "What if there was a business model that protected good workers while still serving customers well? What if dignity and security were built into the system instead of being accidental byproducts when you're lucky enough to have decent management?" Elena's coffee cooled as she listened to Sullivan outline an idea that was part business proposition, part social experiment, and part personal mission. He envisioned a service company that would employ skilled restaurant workers directly, then contract their services to establishments that needed experienced staff. The workers would have benefits, job security, and protection from arbitrary customer complaints. The restaurants would get reliable, well-trained employees without the overhead of full-time staff management. "Think of it as consulting, but for service work," Sullivan said. "We'd maintain standards, provide training, handle all the employment logistics, and most importantly, we'd stand behind our people when unreasonable customers try to get them fired for doing their jobs." Elena was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. The idea was ambitious and complex, with obvious potential benefits, but also significant risks. And you want me to be involved in this how? I want you to help me design it, Sullivan said simply. You understand the industry from the worker's perspective in ways I never could. You know what kind of protection and support would actually make a difference, what kind of training would be valuable, how to maintain service quality while ensuring worker dignity. And in return? Sullivan had anticipated this question, but still felt nervous about his answer. Partnership, not just employment, but actual equity in the business. Your knowledge and experience would be as valuable as my capital investment. If this works, if we can prove that treating workers well is also good business, you'd share in the profits proportionally. Elena stared at him, searching for signs of condescension or manipulation, looking for the catch that her experience suggested must be hidden somewhere in an offer that seemed too generous to be genuine. But Sullivan met her gaze steadily, and she found herself believing that he meant exactly what he was saying. Why me? She asked finally. You could partner with industry consultants, business school graduates, people with credentials and connections, because they wouldn't have been on their knees collecting broken glass while a customer publicly humiliated them, Sullivan replied. They wouldn't know what it feels like to be viewed as dispensable despite years of excellent work. They wouldn't understand the daily reality of service work in ways that would make this business authentic rather than just another corporate initiative. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a cautious hope mixed with the kind of fear that comes with unexpected opportunities. This would be a huge risk. Starting a new business, especially one that challenges how the industry works, most startups fail. Most do, Sullivan agreed, but I've built my wealth by identifying market opportunities that others miss. I think there's a real demand for this kind of service, from both workers and employers. And Elena, I've watched you work. I've seen how you handle pressure, how you maintain professionalism under attack, how you care about doing your job well even when customers treat you badly. Those are exactly the qualities that would make this business succeed. Elena thought about her current situation, working at Rosie's Diner for wages that barely covered her basic expenses, no benefits, no security, no prospect of advancement. She thought about her children, about the dreams she had deferred to focus on survival, about the skills and experience she had accumulated over 15 years of service work that had never been recognized as valuable assets. What would this partnership look like practically, she asked. I don't have business training, don't know about corporate structure or legal requirements. We'd start small, Sullivan explained. Maybe contract with 3 or 4 restaurants initially, employ a dozen experienced servers and kitchen staff. You'd help design the training programs, establish service standards, create the policies that would protect workers while ensuring customer satisfaction. I'd handle the financial and legal aspects, but all major decisions would be made together. Elena could see both the potential and the challenges clearly. The idea appealed to her sense of justice and her understanding of what the industry needed, but it also represented a level of responsibility and visibility that she had never sought or imagined for herself. I'd need time to think about this, she said finally. This isn't the kind of decision I can make quickly. Of course, Sullivan replied. Take all the time you need. And Elena, I want you to know that regardless of whether you decide to partner with me on this business, I owe you an apology and whatever help I can provide. What happened to you at the bistro was wrong, and I should have done more to prevent it. Elena looked at this wealthy man who had driven across the city to find her, who was proposing to build a business around the dignity of workers like herself, who seemed genuinely committed to turning his moment of speaking up for her into something more substantial and lasting. Can I ask you something? She said. What do you really get out of this? I mean, you're already successful, already wealthy. Why complicate your life with a risky business that's really about social justice as much as profit? Sullivan considered the question carefully. Because watching what happened to you made me realize that all the wealth I've accumulated doesn't mean much if I use it only to insulate myself from problems rather than to solve them. Because I have a daughter who worked service jobs in college, and I want her to live in a world where good work is respected, regardless of whether it requires a college degree. Because I've learned that character reveals itself under pressure, and I want to build something that rewards character rather than punishing it." Elena finished her coffee, now cold but appreciated for the warmth it had provided during this unexpected conversation. "If I said yes to this, when would we start?" "Whenever you're ready," Sullivan replied. "We could begin planning immediately, but we wouldn't launch until you felt confident about every aspect of the operation." Elena stood, gathering her purse and the coat that had seen too many Chicago winters. "Give me a week to think about this. I'll call you with my answer." As she walked back toward the diner to collect her car, Elena felt the weight of possibility settling on her shoulders. For the first time in years, she was contemplating a future that involved more than surviving from paycheck to paycheck, more than accepting whatever treatment customers and management chose to dish out, more than being invisible in a world that depended on her work, but rarely acknowledged her worth. Sullivan remained at the coffee shop table long after Elena left, staring out the window at the neighborhood that represented a side of Chicago his wealth usually shielded him from seeing. He thought about market opportunities and social impact, about the mathematics of dignity and the economics of respect. But mostly, he thought about Elena Morales, and whether she would choose to trust him with her experience and her future, in service of an idea that could change both their lives and the lives of countless others who deserved better than the industry currently offered them. A week later, Elena's phone call would give him his answer, and set in motion a partnership that neither of them could have imagined when she first served his table at Millennium Park Bistro, with quiet competence that went unnoticed until the moment it was threatened. Elena spent the week thinking about Sullivan's proposal with the same careful consideration she brought to all major decisions in her life. She discussed it with her son Miguel, who had grown up watching his mother navigate the complexities of service work with dignity, despite the challenges it presented. She talked it over with her daughter Sophia, now studying business at community college with the help of Elena's careful saving and sacrifice. She even called her mother in Puerto Rico, seeking the wisdom that came from a woman who had raised 5 children through her own understanding of when to take risks and when to prioritize security. The responses were mixed, but ultimately supportive. Miguel worried about the risk of leaving a steady job, even one that barely paid the bills, for the uncertainty of a startup business. Sophia was excited about the possibility of her mother becoming an entrepreneur, seeing it as validation of the intelligence and competence she had always recognized in Elena's work. Her mother, now 78 and sharp as ever, listened to the entire explanation before offering her perspective with characteristic directness. "Mijita," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the miles between Chicago and San Juan. "You've been taking care of other people your whole life. Maybe it's time to take care of yourself by building something that takes care of others too." Elena also spent time observing her work environment at Rosie's Diner with new eyes, paying attention to the dynamics between staff and management, between servers and customers, between the economic realities of the business and the human needs of the people who made it function. She watched her co-workers, mostly women like herself, mostly struggling to make ends meet on wages that hadn't kept pace with Chicago's rising cost of living, mostly accepting poor treatment as the price of employment in an industry that viewed them as replaceable. But she also noticed the regulars who appreciated good service, who understood the difference between competent and indifferent staff, who would pay more for reliability and quality if it were consistently available. She saw restaurant managers struggling with high turnover, training costs, and the challenge of maintaining service standards when employees had no incentive to develop long-term professional skills. Sullivan's business model began to make more sense as Elena observed these dynamics. There was indeed inefficiency in the current system, waste in both human and economic terms that a different approach might address successfully. The question was whether she was prepared to risk her modest security to help build that different approach. On Thursday evening, Elena made her decision. She called Sullivan from her small apartment, the same phone she used to coordinate schedules and handle the logistics of working-class life, now about to commit to a partnership that could either transform her circumstances or leave her worse off than she had started. "Mr. Sullivan," she said when he answered, I've thought about your proposal. Please, he interrupted gently. Call me James. If we're going to be partners, we should start with first names. The word partners still sounded strange to Elena, implying a level of equality and mutual respect that she had rarely experienced in business relationships. James, then. I want to do this, but I have conditions. Of course. What do you need? Elena had prepared for this conversation carefully. First, I need to keep working at the diner until our business is generating enough income to support me. I can't afford to lose my current wages while we're getting started. Absolutely, Sullivan agreed. I'd expect you to maintain your current income throughout the development phase. In fact, I'd want to supplement it so you can reduce your hours and focus more time on building the business. Elena felt a flutter of relief. Financial security during the transition had been her primary concern. Second, I want legal documentation of the partnership from the beginning. If this succeeds, I want to be sure my contributions are formally recognized, not just verbally promised. I wouldn't have it any other way, Sullivan replied. My lawyer will draft partnership agreements that specify equity percentages, decision-making authority, and profit-sharing arrangements. You'll have your own attorney review everything before we sign. Third, I want to maintain my relationship with my current coworkers. Some of them might be interested in joining our company eventually, and I don't want to be seen as abandoning them or taking advantage of relationships I've built here. Sullivan paused, considering the implications. That's actually perfect, he said after a moment. We'll need experienced workers we can trust, people who understand service excellence from the ground up. Your connections could be invaluable for recruiting. Elena took a deep breath, preparing for the commitment that would change her life. Then yes, James. I want to be your partner in this business. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of decisions made and futures altered. When Sullivan spoke again, his voice carried both excitement and determination. Elena, I think we're about to build something important together, something that matters beyond just profit margins. I hope so, Elena replied, because I'm risking everything I have on that belief. They spent the next hour on the phone, discussing practical next steps, timeline considerations, and the legal framework that would formalize their partnership. Sullivan would begin the incorporation process immediately, while Elena would start documenting her ideas for worker protection policies, training programs, and service standards that would define their company's approach. When Elena finally hung up the phone, she sat in her small living room surrounded by the modest furniture and carefully maintained possessions that represented her years of working-class survival. Tomorrow, she would continue serving coffee and taking orders at Rosie's Diner, but now she would be doing it as research for her own business, as preparation for building something that could transform the industry that had often undervalued her contributions. She thought about the customers who had treated her dismissively over the years, about the managers who had viewed her as expendable, about the system that had allowed her to be fired for an accident while protecting the customer who had chosen to weaponize the situation. Soon, if their business succeeded, she would be in a position to ensure that other workers weren't subjected to the same injustices, weren't forced to choose between dignity and employment, weren't punished for being human in an industry that often forgot its workers' humanity. Elena Morales, who had spent 15 years serving others while remaining invisible, was about to become a business owner, an entrepreneur, a woman whose voice would help shape the industry that had shaped her. The transformation would not be easy, and success was far from guaranteed. But for the first time in years, Elena felt like she was moving toward something rather than simply surviving what came next. The partnership that began with a spilled glass of water was about to become something neither Elena nor Sullivan could have imagined when they first met across the social divide of a restaurant table. When dignity met wealth and found common ground in the simple recognition that good work deserved respect regardless of the uniform worn by the person performing it. 6 months later, Dignified Service Solutions occupied a small office in Chicago's West Loop, a modest space that reflected both the startup nature of the business and its founder's commitment to investing in substance rather than appearance. Elena arrived each morning at 7, still surprised by the novelty of wearing business casual clothing instead of a restaurant uniform, still adjusting to the reality that she was now someone who employed others rather than being employed by them. The company had launched with 4 partner restaurants and 12 employees, all experienced service workers who had been carefully selected for their professionalism, reliability, and commitment to dignified service. Elena had insisted on interviewing each potential hire personally, looking for the same qualities she had tried to embody throughout her own career: competence under pressure, genuine care for customer satisfaction, and the kind of quiet strength that maintained dignity even in difficult circumstances. The business model was proving more successful than even Sullivan's optimistic projections had suggested. Restaurants were discovering that workers who felt secure and respected provided noticeably better service, leading to improved customer satisfaction scores and increased repeat business. The contracted employees, meanwhile, were thriving under a system that protected them from arbitrary termination while providing benefits and advancement opportunities that traditional service work rarely offered. Elena's role had evolved naturally into a combination of operations manager, staff advocate, and customer relations specialist. She spent her mornings handling scheduling and quality control, her afternoons meeting with restaurant partners and potential clients, and her evenings developing training materials and employee support programs. It was more responsibility than she had ever carried, but also more satisfying work than she had ever imagined possible. The transformation in her own circumstances was dramatic, but carefully managed. Elena had moved from her small apartment to a modest house in a neighborhood where she felt safe and comfortable, close enough to her old community to maintain connections, but far enough to represent genuine progress. She had been able to pay for Sophia's remaining college expenses without requiring student loans, had helped Miguel establish his own apartment, and had even begun sending more substantial support to her mother in Puerto Rico. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Elena saw herself and how others saw her. She was no longer invisible, no longer someone who existed at the margins of other people's experiences. Restaurant owners sought her advice on staff management. Industry publications interviewed her about innovative employment models. Community organizations invited her to speak about entrepreneurship and worker advocacy. The partnership with Sullivan had developed into genuine mutual respect and friendship. Their different backgrounds and perspectives had proved complementary rather than divisive, with Elena's practical experience balancing Sullivan's strategic vision and financial resources. They made major decisions together, celebrated successes together, and worked through challenges with the kind of collaborative approach that Elena had rarely experienced in traditional employment hierarchies. On a warm September afternoon, exactly 1 year after their first conversation at the coffee shop, Elena and Sullivan sat in their shared office reviewing quarterly reports that exceeded all their initial projections. The business was not only profitable, but growing, with additional restaurant partners requesting their services and experienced workers from across Chicago inquiring about employment opportunities. "I have something to tell you," Elena said, setting down the financial statements with a smile that didn't quite hide her nervousness. Sullivan looked up from his laptop, where he had been reviewing expansion plans for their second year of operations. "Good news or challenging news?" "Good news, I think," Elena replied. "I've been approached by the Chicago Restaurant Association about developing industry-wide standards for service worker protection and advancement. They want to use our model as a template for improving employment practices across the city." Sullivan's face lit up with excitement. "Elena, that's incredible. That's exactly the kind of systemic change we hope to inspire." Elena nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. "It is. But it would also mean expanding our role beyond just running a profitable business. We'd be taking on the responsibility of trying to transform an entire industry, becoming advocates as much as entrepreneurs." "Are you ready for that?" Sullivan asked, understanding the magnitude of what she was considering. Elena looked around their office, at the employee photos on the wall, at the thank you notes from satisfied restaurant partners, at the evidence of what they had built together in just 1 year. A year ago, I was collecting broken glass from a restaurant floor while a customer publicly humiliated me. Today, industry leaders are asking for my expertise on worker dignity and employment policy. I think I'm ready for whatever comes next. Sullivan smiled. Recognizing the quiet strength that had first drawn his attention to Elena when she was serving his table with professional grace, despite being treated badly by other customers. Then we'll do it together, just like we've done everything else. Elena's phone rang, interrupting their planning session. The caller ID showed the name of a restaurant owner in downtown Chicago, one of several who had been requesting meetings about potentially joining their network of partner establishments. Elena Morales, Dignified Service Solutions, she answered, still feeling a small thrill at hearing her own name connected to a business she had helped create. As she spoke with the potential client, explaining their employment model and service philosophy, Sullivan watched her with satisfaction and pride. Elena had transformed from someone who absorbed professional humiliation in silence to someone who was actively reshaping the industry that had once undervalued her contributions. Her voice carried authority earned through both experience and success. Her ideas commanded respect from people who might once have dismissed her as merely a waitress. Her vision was becoming reality through the practical application of dignity and competence working together. When Elena finished her call, she turned to Sullivan with the kind of smile that illuminated her entire face. That was the Fairmont Hotel. They want to contract all their banquet service through us starting next month. That would mean hiring 15 additional staff members and establishing our first hospitality sector partnership. "And how do you feel about that?" Sullivan asked, though her expression already suggested the answer. "I feel like we're just getting started," Elena replied. "Like everything we've built so far has been preparation for the real work of changing how this industry treats the people who make it function." Sullivan nodded, understanding that their partnership had evolved beyond business success into something closer to a mission. They had proved that treating workers with dignity was not only morally right but economically smart, that protecting employee security led to better customer service, that investing in people rather than exploiting them created value for everyone involved in the transaction. As the afternoon sun slanted through their office windows, Elena and Sullivan returned to planning their company's expansion, their industry advocacy, and their continued commitment to ensuring that no other worker would have to endure the kind of public humiliation that had inadvertently brought them together. They were no longer just a millionaire and a waitress who had recognized each other's humanity across the divide of social class. They were partners building a legacy that honored both dignity and success as equally valuable achievements in the complicated mathematics of American capitalism. Elena Morales had found her voice, her platform, and her power. The woman who had once been invisible was now impossible to ignore, and she intended to use that visibility to ensure that others like her would never again have to choose between self-respect and survival in the simple act of serving others with grace and competence. 2 years after Elena Morales had knelt to collect broken glass while a customer publicly berated her, she stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton, addressing the Chicago Restaurant Association's annual conference. The irony was not lost on her. She was speaking in one of the hotels where she might once have worked serving banquets, now addressing an audience of restaurant owners, industry leaders, and hospitality executives who hung on her every word as she explained the revolutionary success of Dignified Service Solutions. Elena wore a navy blue dress that struck exactly the right balance between professional authority and approachable warmth, her hair styled simply but elegantly. Her posture conveying the confidence that came from having transformed not just her own life, but an entire approach to service industry employment. Behind her, a PowerPoint presentation displayed the impressive statistics that had made her company a case study taught in business schools. A 95% employee retention rate, customer satisfaction scores that consistently exceeded industry averages, and profit margins that proved treating workers well was also tremendously good business. 3 years ago, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. I was a waitress who believed that dignity and security were luxuries I couldn't afford in service work. I thought that being treated poorly by customers and management was simply the price of employment in this industry. I was wrong. And today I want to explain why changing that assumption has created opportunities for all of us. In the audience, James Sullivan watched with unconcealed pride as his partner commanded the attention of Chicago's hospitality elite. Their business had grown beyond their most optimistic projections, now employing over 200 service workers across 37 restaurant and hotel partners throughout the city. But more importantly, their model was being studied and replicated in cities across the country, inspiring a movement toward employment practices that recognized service workers as skilled professionals rather than replaceable components. Elena clicked to her next slide, showing retention and performance statistics that demonstrated the economic benefits of their approach. When we started Dignified Service Solutions, some people told us we were being naive, that good intentions couldn't overcome industry realities. But what we've discovered is that industry realities were actually creating inefficiencies that better employment practices could solve. She told the story of Maria Santos, a single mother who had been working part-time at 3 different restaurants with no benefits and no security, barely able to support her family despite working 60 hours a week. Through Dignified Service Solutions, Maria now worked full-time at 2 partner establishments with health insurance, paid vacation time, and a savings account that was allowing her to plan for her daughter's college education. Maria's story isn't unique, Elena continued. We have dozens of employees who have transformed their lives simply by being treated with the respect and security that allows them to focus on providing excellent service rather than worrying about arbitrary termination or benefitless employment. Elena clicked to a slide showing customer satisfaction data, explaining how protected and supported workers consistently outperformed industry standards in every measurable category. When employees feel secure and valued, they invest more energy in customer satisfaction. When they're not worried about losing their jobs over customer complaints that may or may not be justified, they're more willing to go above and beyond normal service expectations. The audience was taking notes, asking questions, clearly recognizing that Elena's presentation represented more than just a successful business story. It was a roadmap for addressing labor shortages, retention problems, and service quality issues that had plagued the industry for years. During the question and answer session, a restaurant owner from Michigan raised his hand. Ms. Morales, this all sounds wonderful in theory, but what about the additional costs? How do you maintain profitability while providing these enhanced benefits and protections? Elena smiled, having anticipated this question. Our profit margins are actually higher than industry averages, not lower. When you reduce turnover, you eliminate constant hiring and training costs. When you have experienced, committed staff, you reduce waste, improve efficiency, and increase customer retention. When you provide health insurance and paid time off, you reduce absenteeism and improve worker productivity. The math works in favor of treating people well. Another questioner asked about handling difficult customers, the kind who might complain about service or make unreasonable demands. We train both our staff and our restaurant partners in conflict resolution, Elena explained. But we also make it clear that our employees are protected from abuse or arbitrary punishment. If a customer complaint seems unjustified or motivated by bias rather than actual service failures, we investigate before taking any action. Our workers know they won't be thrown under the bus to appease unreasonable customers. After her presentation, Elena was surrounded by restaurant owners wanting to learn more about partnering with her company. Industry consultants requesting meetings to discuss implementing similar models in their cities, and trade publication reporters seeking interviews about the implications of her success for broader industry transformation. But the moment that meant the most to Elena came when a young woman approached during the networking reception that followed her talk. The woman was wearing the kind of restaurant uniform Elena remembered all too well. Black pants, white shirt, comfortable shoes that had walked countless miles across dining room floors. "Ms. Morales," the woman said quietly, "I waited tables to pay for college, and I graduate next month with a business degree. After hearing your presentation today, I want to ask, are you hiring?" "Because I want to work for a company that treats people the way you treat your employees." Elena handed her a business card, but more importantly, she saw in this young woman's eyes the same intelligence and dignity she had tried to maintain throughout her own years of service work. "Call me next week," Elena said. "We're always looking for people who understand both the challenges and the opportunities in this industry." As the reception wound down, Sullivan joined Elena near the hotel's windows overlooking downtown Chicago. The city lights stretched out below them, representing millions of workers in thousands of businesses, many of them struggling with the same issues of dignity and security that Elena had faced just a few years earlier. "How does it feel to be a keynote speaker rather than the person serving the keynote speaker's dinner?" Sullivan asked with a gentle smile. Elena considered the question seriously. "It feels like responsibility," she said finally. "Like everything we've built is just the beginning of what we need to accomplish. There are thousands of workers in the city alone who deserve better than what the industry typically offers them." Sullivan nodded, understanding that Elena's success hadn't diminished her commitment to the workers who remained where she had once been. If anything, her platform had amplified her sense of obligation to use her influence on behalf of people who rarely had advocates in boardrooms or policy discussions. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Sophia, now graduated from college and working as a social worker. "Watched your presentation online, Mom. So proud of you. You're changing the world one job at a time." Elena showed Sullivan the message, both of them smiling at Sophia's assessment. "One job at a time," Elena repeated. "Maybe that's exactly how change happens, not through grand gestures or dramatic announcements, but through treating people with dignity and proving that it works better than the alternatives." As they left the Palmer house and walked out into the Chicago night, Elena reflected on the distance she had traveled from that humiliating moment at Millennium Park Bistro to this evening's triumph. But she also thought about all the workers still facing the insecurities and indignities she had once endured, still serving others while remaining largely invisible, still deserving better than an industry that viewed them as expendable. Elena Morales had transformed her own life and built a successful business, but more importantly, she had proved that service work could be performed with dignity, security, and respect. Her story was no longer just about one woman's journey from humiliation to empowerment. It had become a model for reimagining an entire industry's relationship with the workers who made it function. The woman who had once been reduced to her worst moment was now defining industry best practices, and she was just getting started. 5 years after that life-changing evening at Millennium Park Bistro, Elena Morales stood in her own restaurant, dignified, the flagship establishment that served as both a profitable business and a demonstration of everything she and James Sullivan had learned about treating workers with respect while maintaining exceptional service standards. The restaurant occupied a prime location in Chicago's River North District, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering diners spectacular views of the city's skyline while creating an atmosphere that somehow managed to feel both elegant and warmly welcoming. But what distinguished Dignified from other upscale Chicago restaurants wasn't just its innovative cuisine or stunning decor. It was the revolutionary employment model that guaranteed every worker a living wage, comprehensive benefits, paid vacation time, and most importantly, protection from the kind of arbitrary treatment that had once cost Elena her job at another establishment. The servers, kitchen staff, and support team all carried themselves with the confidence that came from knowing their professionalism was valued and their security was protected. Elena moved through the dining room during the busy Friday evening service, no longer carrying plates, but overseeing an operation that had become a pilgrimage site for hospitality industry professionals wanting to study her model. She wore a sleek black dress that reflected her role as owner and CEO, but her interactions with staff maintained the warmth and respect that had defined her approach since the beginning. "Table 7 needs extra parmesan for their risotto," called Maria Santos, the same former colleague from Elena's waitressing days, who now served as Dignified's front-of-house manager. Maria had flourished under the security and advancement opportunities that Elena's company provided, eventually earning a business management degree through the educational assistance program that was part of every employee's benefits package. Elena nodded, noting the request, while simultaneously reviewing the evening's reservation list, checking on kitchen timing, and monitoring the subtle dynamics that determined whether a restaurant service would be merely adequate or truly exceptional. Her years of experience had taught her to read the rhythm of a dining room like a musician reading sheet music, anticipating problems before they developed and ensuring that every guest received the kind of attentive service she had once provided while remaining essentially invisible to the people she served. At table 12, the same number as the table where her humiliation had begun years earlier, sat a young couple celebrating their anniversary. The woman was obviously nervous about the prices on the menu, her posture suggesting someone unaccustomed to dining in restaurants where appetizers cost more than she usually spent on entire meals. Her boyfriend was trying to project confidence while clearly calculating costs in his head, counting the expense of this special evening against other financial priorities. Elena approached their table with the gentle manner that had always distinguished her service style. "Good evening," she said warmly. "I'm Elena, one of the owners here. I noticed this is your first time dining with us. Is there anything special we can do to make your evening memorable?" The young woman looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting personal attention from restaurant ownership. "It's our 2-year anniversary," she said somewhat shyly. "We've been saving up to eat somewhere really nice." Elena smiled, remembering countless couples she had served during her waitressing years, recognizing the mixture of excitement and anxiety that came with stretching financially for a special celebration. "Congratulations! 2 years is worth celebrating properly." She lingered at their table for a few more minutes, discussing menu options and making recommendations that would create a memorable experience while respecting their budget considerations. Her approach combined the genuine warmth she had always brought to customer service with the authority and confidence that came from owning the establishment, creating an interaction that honored both their celebration and their financial reality. As Elena moved away from the table, she noticed James Sullivan entering the restaurant with a small group of business associates. Their partnership had evolved over the years into something that transcended their original business relationship, becoming a friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to proving that ethical business practices were also profitable business practices. Sullivan caught her eye and nodded toward his guests with a slightly raised eyebrow, the subtle signal they had developed to indicate that he was bringing potential investors or partners who might be interested in their expanding network of dignified employment opportunities. Elena smiled and approached their table with the professional warmth that had become her signature style. "James, gentlemen, welcome to Dignified," she said, shaking hands with each member of the party. "We have an excellent wine selection tonight, and I'd be happy to recommend some options that pair well with our seasonal menu." As she discussed wine choices and menu highlights with Sullivan's guests, Elena was simultaneously demonstrating the service philosophy that had made her company successful. She wasn't just recommending food and drink. She was creating an experience that acknowledged her guests' interests, preferences, and the significance of their gathering. Her attention was genuine without being intrusive, knowledgeable without being condescending, efficiently focused on their satisfaction while maintaining the dignity and authority that came from being a business owner rather than a service worker dependent on their approval for economic survival. Later in the evening, during a brief lull in service, Elena joined Sullivan's table for a few minutes of conversation. His guests had been impressed with both the food quality and the service excellence, but more importantly, They had noticed the way staff members carried themselves with confidence and professionalism that exceeded what they typically observed in restaurant environments. "Elena," said one of the investors, a woman who owned several hotels in the Midwest, "I've been watching your staff tonight, and there's something different about their demeanor. They seem more invested in what they're doing, more professional." Elena nodded, pleased that the difference was so visible. When people feel secure in their employment and respected for their skills, they naturally provide better service. Our employees know they won't be fired arbitrarily. They receive fair wages and benefits, and they have opportunities for advancement within our company. That security allows them to focus on excellence rather than survival. The conversation continued for several minutes, covering the practical details of Elena's employment model and its potential for replication in other markets. But as Elena excused herself to oversee the evening's final service details, she reflected on how far she had traveled from that devastating moment when she had been publicly humiliated while simply trying to do her job competently and with dignity. Near closing time, Elena found herself in the kitchen alongside her head chef, reviewing the evening's performance and planning for tomorrow's prep work. The kitchen operated with the kind of smooth efficiency that came from experienced professionals, working in an environment where their skills were valued and their contributions recognized. No one was screaming orders or berating staff for minor mistakes. Instead, the atmosphere reflected the calm confidence of people who knew their work mattered and their positions were secure. "Elena," called one of the servers, approaching with a small envelope. "The couple at table 12 asked me to give you this before they left." Elena opened the envelope to find a handwritten note. "Thank you for making our anniversary so special. The food was amazing, but more than that, you made us feel welcomed and valued as customers. We'll definitely be back, and we'll tell our friends about Dignified. You've created something really beautiful here." Elena smiled, folding the note carefully and adding it to the collection she maintained of customer feedback. These personal responses meant more to her than the business awards or industry recognition, because they represented the real purpose of everything she had built, creating experiences that honored both the people providing service and the people receiving it, proving that dignity and excellence could coexist profitably in an industry that had too often forced workers to choose between self-respect and employment. As Elena locked up Dignified and walked out into the Chicago night, she passed the alley where she had once stood after being fired from Millennium Park Bistro, tears mixing with the city's persistent drizzle, as she wondered how she would explain her termination to her children and cover her expenses until she found new work. Now, 5 years later, she employed over 400 people across her various businesses, had been featured on the cover of Restaurant Business magazine, and was consulted by policymakers developing legislation to improve service industry working conditions. But perhaps the most satisfying transformation was internal. Elena Morales no longer apologized for taking up space in the world, no longer accepted that dignified treatment was a luxury she couldn't afford, no longer believed that her value was determined by other people's willingness to recognize it. She had learned that dignity was not something granted by customers or employers, but something she possessed inherently, something she could extend to others while maintaining for herself, something that grew stronger when shared rather than diminished when claimed. Elena Morales had not just survived her moment of public humiliation, she had transformed it into the foundation for building a business empire based on the radical idea that all work deserved respect, all workers deserved security, and success was possible without sacrificing either principle for profit. The woman who had once knelt to collect broken glass while absorbing verbal abuse now stood as proof that grace under pressure, competence in adversity, and dignity in service were not weaknesses to be exploited, but strengths to be honored and rewarded. Her story had become larger than her personal journey from waitress to CEO. It had become a demonstration that the American dream was still accessible to those brave enough to insist that dignity and success were not mutually exclusive, that treating people well was not just morally right, but economically smart. The transformation was possible for anyone willing to see their worst moments as opportunities to build something better. Now, I want to speak directly to you, wherever you're listening to this story. Maybe you're driving home after a shift that left you feeling invisible. Maybe you're sitting in your break room wondering if anyone notices the care you put into your work. Maybe you're questioning whether dignity is something you can afford while you're just trying to pay the bills. Elena Morales' story is not just about one woman's journey from humiliation to empowerment. It's about the possibility that exists within each of us to transform our circumstances, to demand better treatment, to recognize that our worth is not determined by how others choose to see us, but by how we choose to see ourselves. Have you ever found yourself in Elena's position, publicly embarrassed while simply trying to do your job well? Have you ever felt invisible while making other people's days brighter, unappreciated while providing essential services, dismissed while demonstrating skills and competence that deserve recognition? If so, you are not alone. Your experience matters, your dignity is non-negotiable, and your potential for transformation is real. Elena's story began with broken glass and tears, but it became a testament to the power of refusing to accept that good people deserve bad treatment simply because they work in service industries. I want to hear your story. Have you ever been the quiet hero in someone else's experience, the person whose competence and kindness went unnoticed until something went wrong? Have you ever stood up for someone being treated unfairly, or had someone stand up for you when you couldn't defend yourself? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story matters and others need to hear it. If Elena's journey resonated with you, if it reminded you that dignity and success can coexist, if it inspired you to believe that transformation is possible even from our worst moments, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their worth is not determined by their worst day, that service work deserves respect, that invisible people can become impossible to ignore when they find their voices and claim their power. For more stories that honor the quiet strength of working people, the dignity of service, and the possibility of transformation through seemingly impossible circumstances, click on our curated podcast playlist. These are stories about real people facing real challenges, finding ways to honor their humanity while navigating systems that often forget workers are human beings deserving of respect and security. Elena Morales transformed her moment of deepest humiliation into the foundation for building a business empire based on treating people well. She proved that dignity is not a luxury but a necessity, that respect is not earned through wealth but demonstrated through character, that the American dream is still possible for those brave enough to insist that success and kindness are not mutually exclusive. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one woman's transformation from invisible service worker to visible business leader, from victim of injustice to creator of opportunity, from someone who absorbed humiliation in silence to someone who speaks up for workers everywhere who deserve better than the industry typically offers them. Your story matters. Your dignity is non-negotiable. Your potential for positive change is real. And sometimes, the most profound transformations begin with the simple decision to treat yourself and others with the respect that every human being deserves, regardless of the uniform they wear or the work they perform. See you in our next story, where we'll continue exploring the extraordinary possibilities that exist within ordinary lives, the dignified strength that emerges from challenging circumstances, and the hope that tomorrow can be better than today for anyone willing to believe that change is possible and worth pursuing.